Welcome to the channel. Today we're sharing a cheating story you won't believe. If you enjoy it, please like and subscribe. Let's get started. Looking back on my life and everything that's happened, you might think I'd feel angry, hateful, or bitter. But instead, I feel nothing. This emptiness messes with how I think, makes it hard to judge things clearly, and keeps me from even grieving the loss of my own emotions. I wish I could grieve. My name is Mark, though it's not particularly important. My story starts over 25 years ago when I was a young man, happily married with a young daughter whom we cherished deeply. Life was good. I had recently received a promotion, was up to date on our mortgage payments, had supportive friends and family, and kept fit by jogging and cycling to work, weather permitting. Then the unthinkable happened. Hannah, a 12-year-old girl from Lakeside, went missing. The entire community was in shock, and for a few weeks, everyone was extra cautious with their children. The police conducted door-to-door inquiries, but they didn't seem to uncover much. A few days later, blood-stained clothing was discovered in Woodford Park, not far from the crime scene itself. I was familiar with that area as I jogged through it regularly on my way to work. Although I was in the vicinity at the time, I never saw Hannah, as I told the police. After finding the clothing, the police intensified their focus on those who might have witnessed something and called me in again for questioning. I repeated that I hadn't seen or heard anything. My wife, Sophie, held my hand during the interview, and it was clear the police were not pleased. Nonetheless, confident in my innocence, I agreed to let them examine my jogging gear. Sophie mentioned that she had washed the items, but the police took them along with my trainers anyway. The next day, the local paper announced that the police were following several lines of inquiry, but were hoping for a resolution soon. No doubt this was said due to the local MP getting involved, along with national newspaper attention, despite there being no body as yet. The day after, I was woken up by the police at around 6 a.m., and I was arrested and forcibly taken out of the house. Despite my attempts to say I would come voluntarily, I was dragged away in handcuffs as my wife was left holding our terrified daughter and trying to comfort her as our neighbors, woken by the incident, all craned their heads out of various doors and windows to watch the scene. I was terrified and confused but certain it was all a mistake and that it would soon be sorted out. After all, I had faith in the Lakeside justice system, the kind of faith that comes from never having run into the system before. I spent several hours in the cells awaiting some form of action, gradually becoming more and more agitated and feeling more and more powerless. Finally, I was taken to an interview room and questioned, going over and over the same details I had given the police earlier and giving the same answers, which did not appear to please them one bit. "Look, we know you were involved," one of them finally said. "Why don't you just come clean and tell us what you did with her?" "Because I wasn't involved and don't know," was all I could answer before finally asking for a solicitor, as they showed no signs of either releasing me or verifying my story, other than to insist I was involved and they had evidence to link me to Hannah. The solicitor duly arrived, and I was told to say no more and that a magistrate would probably release me when I saw one, probably later that day. Well, I did see the magistrate, only to end up remanded in custody pending further police inquiries, allowing them more time to check various inquiries and evidence. The small court was packed with reporters, and my name was now in the nation's consciousness. Some members of the public hurled abuse at me. I thought it was the worst day of my life. How wrong I was. I didn't see the papers the following day, but they had dug up a picture of me from somewhere and gone over my life with a fine-tooth comb. My wife and daughter had apparently been forced into hiding due to various threats being made. My parents and friends seemed to have gone into total denial of the events surrounding me. Even the company I worked for simply put out a bland statement saying they were cooperating with the police in their inquiries. The press, local and national, of course, were having a field day, and anyone I'd ever known, or indeed said they knew me, was being interviewed, and I was not being presented in a good light at all. Trial by media is not supposed to exist, but believe me, it does. The police had naturally ransacked the house, taking away various contents. Again, they were keeping any evidence they had or hadn't found close to their chest for now. Eventually, though, I was charged. The serious nature of the accusation was such that I was remanded in custody to prevent me from absconding, and also, my solicitor told me in an aside, to protect me from being lynched, such was the speculation about my part in the crime. Jail was horrific. I had to be placed in solitary for my own protection, though it didn't stop incidents from occurring. It seems I was not too popular with the staff either. Yet, all through this, I held to my story, the simple truth, as if it would somehow become clear to the police and courts. My solicitor and the barrister now representing me had warned me that somehow or other, the forensic evidence found linked me to the scene where the clothing had been found, quite specifically. The trial destroyed all notions I had of fair play and justice. My solicitor even tried to persuade me that if I knew anything, I should tell him so that he could plea bargain or seek mitigation for me. As it was, I pleaded not guilty and then had to watch as a web of circumstances and what appeared to be falsified evidence was presented by the prosecution. The police had found blood matching the girls on my trainers. There were also other traces on my tracksuit too. The claim was also made that they had found traces of my DNA on the bloody clothing found in the park. They also told the court that several adult magazines and videos of a dubious nature had been found in my house. My defense was poor. My wife testified that she had washed the tracksuit but saw no traces of blood. When pressed, she admitted she had just thrown it in the machine without inspecting it. She knew nothing about the adult videos, however, nor did I. In all, she made herself look as if she was trying too hard to cover for me and that I possibly had some sort of secret life. The attempts to challenge the scientific evidence fell on deaf ears. The company doing the tests simply said mistakes were not made, and I never thought to challenge it independently. I was found guilty of the abduction of a minor, sexual assault, and murder, despite Hannah's body still not having been found. I was sentenced to 25 years in jail. Sentencing ended in uproar, as threats from the girl's family were hurled at me, many screaming that I should have gotten life. One tried to leap the barrier to get to the dock as I was led away. I ended up in the special category wing at Cedarwood Correctional Facility, alone, abandoned by friends and family, none of whom had turned up for the trial unless as witnesses. I hadn't seen my daughter since my arrest. Letters were returned unopened, and the world believed I was a child-murdering pervert. Even in the wing, things were unpleasant. There are degrees of guilt in the prison pecking order, and I was right at the bottom of it. Most of the time I spent in my cell, as to venture out was to run the gauntlet of kicks, blows, bites, and spitting. Unfortunately, I also had to work in the prison workshops making decorations for holidays and was frequently and violently attacked there, picking up several scars and once a broken arm. I received no visitors at all, not even my wife, who, along with my daughter, appeared to have vanished from the face of the earth. What little I could learn of the circumstances suggested that she had changed her name and gone into hiding, possibly abroad. My mom and dad, fine, upstanding pillars of their local community, had almost withdrawn from the world in shock. They blamed me for their disgrace and loss of standing, utterly disowning me and my memory. Friends and acquaintances weren't around anymore, and I received notice of the termination of my employment in the post. How I managed to survive the first year remains a mystery to me. The memories tend to fade now unless I really try hard to remember. Then I remember why I don't try to remember. But survive I did, though my name had now become a synonym for a child molester, somewhat on a par with the notoriety of other infamous criminals. There were still occasional attacks upon me, though I'd hardened up somewhat, and a lone attack was likely to end up with the attacker bruised and bleeding. Group attacks, however, were sadly rare. Still, I was gaining a reputation as someone you didn't want to mess with, if only because of the constant pressure upon me. After 2 years, I finally started to pull my life together somewhat. My appeals had failed. If anything, they just kept me in the public eye, my barrister sadly told me. I started to study law and began making headway toward getting a legal degree from the Open University. Internet access in prison was non-existent back then, but I did have the use of the prison library, and what little I earned in the prison workshop went mostly to keep me supplied with pen and paper. I started to go over the details in my own mind, using some of the knowledge I had now to try and pick holes in what seemed to me to be a colossal mistake. Naturally, I didn't have access to the police files or the various prosecution reports, well, not immediately. Eventually, my barrister got me access to them. I owe him a debt of thanks. I don't know if he believed me or not, but he never wavered in his duty to me and always gave good and wise counsel. He also freely gave his advice in my chosen area of study and recommended a lot of otherwise obscure points of law in various books relating to my own circumstances. He sadly died before my release but was one of the few who reaffirmed my belief in the kindness of strangers. In my 3rd year, I started to get occasionally pestered by the police. They seemed to find it either instructive or perhaps funny to send trainee detectives in to interview me to see whether they could open up the case to gain more evidence, including where the body was, or at least get a confession of some kind. They didn't have a great deal of imagination, and frankly, I was so starved of outside contact that I would simply agree to speak to them to make a difference in my day. I also started to go to the prison gym to work out. The workout at this stage was merely to get into a position of regaining my fitness and losing some weight. I chose to grow my hair and a beard at this time to alter my appearance and make myself less of a target. Also, because I had started to consider my future, a long way off though it was. My work in the prison workshop ended at this time too, and I got a new job in the prison library which suited me far better. However, I was not permitted to collect books from other wings that were outstanding, which was probably just as well as I was still at risk from attack or my identity becoming known. By the 4th year, I was well on my way to getting my degree in law, though I doubted that any law firm would ever consider taking me on. Nor, as a solicitor, could I see any large client base being available, particularly if my name became known. Still, it was interesting and I learned a lot, including some disturbing facts about police corruption and mistakes made with contaminated DNA evidence, though nothing as yet gave me cause to appeal. My name still occasionally came up in the press. There was a rumor circulating that the allegedly murdered girl was not my only victim and that police were going through old files to see if they could tie me to other cold cases. Hannah's mother made an emotional appeal to me, begging me to tell the police where her daughter was. Something I couldn't do as I truly had no idea. I also came under psychiatric assessment at this time, too. For some reason, my cooperation in answering honestly the psychiatrist's questions caused him to label me a classic sociopath. He wanted details of the case only the murderer could know and got irritated when I wouldn't answer him. After all, how was I supposed to answer that honestly? I stuck to the truth and he couldn't accept it. I finally got my degree in the 5th year and moved on to take the honors course. There was some press agitation that I was being given preferential treatment by being allowed to study, though as this was something all prisoners could do, there wasn't a lot they could do other than get my name on the front pages along with an old picture and get the comment section in their pages all riled up. The police still occasionally visited me, though as my story hadn't changed in the last 6 or 7 years, I think they were getting a little tired of it. I did refuse to see any visitors from the so-called gentlemen of the press. I knew exactly where I stood with them. My anger, bitterness, and confusion had now turned into a cold fury and become a lot more focused as I continued to go over the case files and evidence, looking for flaws. It did appear to me that someone, or perhaps more than one, had gone out of their way to deliberately frame me for Hannah's disappearance and alleged murder. My fitness levels had returned to pretty much where they were just before my incarceration, and I was now regarded as pretty much off-limits to the rest of the block, save only for the newbies, who rapidly learned the hard way that I was as hard as nails and being able to take it and dish it out at least 3 times worse. Even the staff now walked carefully around me, though I had never so much as disobeyed any order given and was always unfailingly polite to them. Naturally, this somehow got into the press that I was now some sort of kingpin enforcer on my wing. I did get a new psychiatrist after refusing to cooperate with the old one anymore. It seemed that there was still a great deal of interest in the goings-on in my head. In my 7th year, I gained an honors degree in law and began to help some of the other inmates with legal advice, as I was finally able to access a limited internet-capable computer in the library. I also began a new series of courses in forensics and the science of crime scene analysis, such as it was back in 2004. I turned down a request from Hannah's mother to come in and see me. I knew what she wanted, and I couldn't help as I explained in a politely worded letter back to her, expressing my deepest sorrow that she couldn't find closure, but that I could not provide it as I had no part in her disappearance. An edited version of the letter somehow made it into the press and read as if I were mocking her and boasting that they would never get me to confess. They even included an artist's impression of my current look, which suited me fine, as I was tentatively forming a plan of action for what I would do upon my still far-off release. I was now certain that I had been deliberately framed for the alleged murder, though I was unsure as to who or indeed why. I did have some very pointed questions I wished to ask my now ex-wife, the decree absolute arriving on the same day for signature, with no address, of course, through a solicitor. I also had some questions for the investigating officer and his team, too, along with the forensics company, though the only way to cross-examine them would be to appeal, and I did not believe as yet I could win an appeal. I did start to catalog and meticulously collect every scrap of information regarding the case that appeared in the news and online, including pictures of all involved. I memorized, though did not catalog, addresses. It might take a while before my release, but I was going to find the truth or die trying. The 8th year of my sentence also saw the last serious physical attack on me. It must have been a slow news day, but one of the major newspapers decided to do some sort of expose on the UK sex criminals residing in prison, and I was in the top 5. Naturally, it was a complete fabrication. I didn't have a TV in my cell nor a gaming console, just an awful lot of books and notepads. Nor was I on any kind of special treatment, including diet. Yet, apparently, I was living a comfortable life while Hannah's mother still mourned and lived in poverty, as she had been unable to return to work due to stress since the crime. I did know the name of the family member interviewed. It seemed he, a brother-in-law, was always available for a quote in person or via a comment online or in the press. He was constantly bringing my name back to the public's attention and led the Justice for Hannah pressure group. I certainly had developed a distinct dislike for the man, as he seemed to thrive on the media attention, and yet I could not put my finger on exactly why. Yet, I suspected there was more to his relationship with Hannah than met the eye. 2 days later, 7 of the inmates who were part of the cleaning crew for that wing decided I was fair game and attacked me as I left the library. I had been sort of expecting it. You become very sensitive to the threat levels around you when in prison, particularly if you're high profile. I didn't know my card was marked if I happened to stray from the special wing, so naturally, I never did. But in this instance, they thought they could do the public and Hannah's family a service. How wrong they were. The first thing I knew was being tripped, narrowly avoiding a sharpened mop handle spearing me. I rolled and came to my feet, back against the wall, to face 7 other inmates, all armed with various makeshift weapons, including toothbrushes with razor blades attached to scar the victim. I yelled for help, but that was simply to gain a little time before I launched a vicious counterattack, slapping the broom handle to one side and jabbing my fingers hard into the eyes of another attacker, making him scream in agony. Quickly twisting, I grabbed the arm of another holding the razor weapon and spun the weapon and his arm directly into the face of a third assailant, then launched a swift kick to the groin of the next nearest. I did most of this without thinking. I had too much experience of being the victim, which had enhanced my aggressiveness to almost ridiculous levels, and if I was going down, I was determined to go down hard. I do believe the only reason I did not get hurt far worse was the fact that the men attacking me wanted to avoid being hurt themselves, something I knew I could take, though not easily. I managed, in the confusion, to grab the sharpened broom handle, but instead of using it as a spear, I used it as a short club, breaking knuckles and, I suspect, the cheekbone of anyone who came too close. Finally, the prison officers came and piled into the fray in numbers, and I dropped the weapon, knowing full well that some of them would just love to have a go at me too. Despite claims that I had attacked them, the 7 were reprimanded, and in one case, one had his sentence extended due to the severity of the injuries he sustained, including a potential loss of eyesight. I was simply reprimanded by the governor for being too aggressive in my own defense, and that was the end of the matter, save for the fact that my reputation in the prison and the wing now meant that I was considered off-limits by pretty much everyone. The fight did make it into the press, but it just served to confirm everyone's opinion that I was a dangerous, savage villain. Such is life. I did receive another letter from Hannah's mom, though, and this one did make me pause to consider Prisoner X. I realize that by now, any attempts to ask you for details over the case of my daughter Hannah will produce the same results. A denial that you were involved in any way, shape, or form. Yet I would like to visit you and look you in the eye as you tell me this. While it may be possible for you to fool me, I do believe that I can judge a character by how they look and what they say. I would still request that you give me the opportunity to do so for Hannah's sake. Regards, Linda. I decided to take a chance, not something I was used to anymore. Dear Linda, if you believe it may help you to decide as to my guilt or not, then by all means make an appointment. I do have some questions myself over Hannah and what happened, though I will understand if it is too painful for you to answer them. Regards, Mark. It took a week to arrange. Linda nearly canceled it due to the media circus whipped up again by her brother-in-law. Even the prison staff were involved, as there seemed to be some sort of pool going on regarding a confession, Linda killing me somehow or me killing Linda. The day finally arrived, and I was led down to the visiting room, somewhere I had never been before, as my previous police interviews had all taken place in a private room. I was escorted by 2 officers to protect the other inmates from what I would do to them if they tried anything with me, quipped one jokingly. I was taken to an isolated table in total silence, as various people in the room stopped talking to get a look at me. I recognized a few reporters too, apparently visiting friends, though I suspected they had none. Linda was finally allowed into the room and to approach the table where I sat. The years and the stress had not been kind to her, and she looked older and tired for a woman in her late 30s. Hello, Mark. She finally greeted me when the silence got a bit too much to bear. Hello, Linda, I replied. I'm so sorry that your visit here has become a media circus. My brother-in-law is highly protective of me and still very angry over Hannah. She responded. He keeps threatening to kill you on your release after parole. I won't be going for parole, I replied. Linda looked confused. But you could get out early, perhaps rebuild your life, she finally said. Parole implies that I have accepted my guilt and wish an opportunity to make amends, I replied. I won't go for parole because I'm not guilty. The only way I'll leave here early is if I get a royal pardon, and that seems highly unlikely. The evidence did implicate you, said Linda quietly. Yes, it did, I replied. Yet you maintain you had nothing to do with Hannah's disappearance, she asked. I did not abduct, assault, or murder your daughter, Linda, I replied. Until she went missing, I didn't know who she was. Yet there was the blood and DNA on the clothing they found, she said. I know, I replied. I don't know how it got there. I believe the forensic company may have cross-contaminated the evidence, but they deny it. The other answer I have is far more disturbing, that it might have been planted, but I don't know why or who would do that to me. What about the adult videos? Linda asked. Not mine, I replied. I do have some questions for my ex-wife, assuming I can find her. Linda sat back and looked at me for a long time in total silence. You may be a very good liar, she said finally, but I find myself believing you. Best keep that to yourself, I replied. If what I suspect turns out to be true in the worst case, then there's someone out there prepared to go to extreme lengths to keep what happened to Hannah pinned on me. Linda nodded. He'll just say that you were uncooperative and leave it at that. Best way, I replied. I will, when I'm released, try to find out what really happened, but the trail will be very cold by then. I'll have a think about it myself, Linda answered. You said you had some questions for me. I do, though please, if it causes you distress, do not answer or leave. He'll understand, I replied. Linda swallowed and then nodded. Did Hannah's behavior change in any way in the weeks leading up to her disappearance? I asked. Not that I can recall, Linda replied. The police have already asked me that. No problems with her education? I asked. No, but I did have an appointment at her school. I'd almost forgotten something about her behavior. She disappeared before it happened, though, Linda said. Might not be important, I said, but I'd like to know what it was about, if only to rule it out. I'll ask, Linda said. On the day Hannah disappeared, can you run me through what she did? I asked. She got up, dressed, had breakfast, and set off for school, said Linda with a tear in her eye. Was she wearing her school uniform? I asked. Yes. Why? Linda replied. Just that the bloody clothing wasn't part of the school uniform, I said. I was told it was her undershirt, Linda answered. Would she normally meet friends on the way to school? I asked. She used to meet her cousins, but they had a falling out recently, and she refused to go around there anymore, Linda said. A fight with the cousins? I asked. She never said. Just that she didn't want to go anymore. I figured it would pass. These things do, Linda replied. I asked several more questions, trying to get to know Hannah as a person, not just as a newspaper report. Finally, visiting time was over and Linda was about to leave. You don't look as I remember you, she said by way of farewell. The beard and hair don't help, I replied. No, you look more mature. And there's both sadness and anger in your eyes. I have much to be sad and angry about, I finished as we parted. The visit was all over the media the following day. Linda's no comment left them both enraged and frustrated. We began a regular correspondence after that, as Linda began to do some investigations of her own, if only to clear some doubts that my questions had raised. Several weeks after that, though, Linda died in a hit-and-run incident. No one was found or prosecuted, and that stream of information to me closed, save only for a letter which arrived the day after her death, addressed to me. Dear Mark, I have put together some information on Hannah's disappearance from the questions you asked me. The school wished to see me about her education standards slipping. Also, she had become violent and angry in the 4 weeks leading up to her disappearance, something I was not aware of. They told the police of this, but it did not get investigated further, as far as I can tell. Her cousins do not recall any fight that occurred between them or any other matter which might stop Hannah from visiting. She simply did not. I asked my sister if she knew of anything, and she did not either, but she said she would ask her husband later if he knew anything. It does appear that there are a few unanswered questions about Hannah that the police overlooked, and I hope at least to speak to the officer who was in charge of the investigation tomorrow. Regards, Linda. As you'd imagine, my suspicions were raised about such a convenient hit-and-run accident. Though again, I was in no position to ask or find out just what was really going on. The following day, the police interviewed me, claiming that Linda's brother-in-law had suggested that she was going to speak to the officer in charge of the investigation regarding something I had said to her. He suggested it was either a confession or information about where Hannah's body was. I showed them a scanned copy of Linda's letter, and they said they'd look into it. As ever, nothing happened, and the letter was not returned to me, though I kept the original. My 9th year in prison started, and it marked the beginning of my legal career. I provided aid to a fellow inmate who was clearly suffering from a case of injustice. I was able to guide him regarding the relevant law and authorities for the grounds of his appeal. He had been let down badly by his legal team, and I advised him to get another one and hand over the information I supplied. It worked, and he was released. I got no official thanks, though I didn't expect any, having warned the guy that my name on anything was bad news as far as the outside world was concerned. That seemed to open the floodgates in prison, as I had a few requests to look into cases where it was believed a genuine injustice had taken place. Some, naturally, were trying it on, but I had a steady, if small, stream of successes added anonymously to my name. I was saddened when my barrister retired due to ill health, but he did inform me that he could still be called privately for requests, though he added that he thought I would no longer need to. I wished him well via letter, of course, and we spoke no more, as he died a few weeks later from cancer. I used some of my meager savings to send a small, anonymous bunch of flowers to his funeral. It seemed so little to send for a man who had done so much for me. I was also given a small bequest in his will, which was unsuccessfully challenged by his family. I received a set of legal books defining the laws of England and Wales, which, after a request to the governor of the prison, I was allowed to store in an annex of the library. It was and is a very impressive collection, and I'm told it's worth quite a bit of money, though cash meant little to me in prison. I was aware that I had a bank account in the real world with about $5,000 supposedly sitting in it from the sale of my house and worldly possessions. I had my barrister to thank for that too, as my ex-wife had attempted to simply claim and spend it all. Linda's brother-in-law had also, at one stage, attempted to sue me in the civil courts of the UK to try and claim it for Linda, but it failed as Linda had refused any blood money. The next few years passed quietly for me. There was some consternation when I failed to apply for parole. The press assumed it was because my guilt was so obvious that I thought I wouldn't get it. The prison officers and the prison hierarchy knew full well why I hadn't applied for it in the last few months before my sentence's halfway point, and with that decision I gained a sort of grudging respect. By 2011, the UK's equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act came fully into force, and I was able to start sending out FOI requests to various places regarding information about my case with limited success, as decisions regarding the legal process were exempt from such requests. Still, I was now starting to untangle the various strands of the process that had led to where I was. I was still persona non grata to my family, and all attempts to find out where my daughter had gone failed. With my final release date approaching, though still several years off, Linda's brother-in-law tried to get a petition going for an extension to my sentence, suggesting that it should be changed to indefinite, subject to judicial review. I could have told him he was wasting his time. Retroactive legislation or trying to apply new laws to past decisions wasn't generally allowed in UK law. It didn't stop him from trying and, once again, keeping my name in the press. I did have a few requests from the press regarding an interview, but I turned them down flat. I worried about becoming institutionalized. It had been nearly 12 years now, and I hadn't had to cook a meal or make any real decisions over my life, simply doing as I was told. My legal work, such as it was, did help there, though. I befriended a young man who wasn't interested in my past. He was a computer hacker accused of illegally downloading content. He helped me to understand computers a lot better, a skill that would benefit me greatly later on. Although I had to be extremely cautious using a prison PC, with the help of my new acquaintance, I was able to bypass several content restrictions and maintain an anonymous online presence in the years leading up to my release. Despite my searches of the web to learn more about the company that had conducted the forensic tests on the evidence from Hannah's case, I found no indication of mistakes, either now or in the past. Still, I kept an eye on them just in case, but I was now pretty convinced that the company was not to blame. I was also able to track down many of the original investigation team and pick up useful bits of information on them. Hannah's family, led by her uncle, was constantly campaigning and lobbying Parliament to have my sentence extended, though with little effect. However, I did strike gold on the Friends of Hannah Facebook page. It was a picture of a past gathering taken several years before and contained several faces now burned into my memory. One face had changed slightly, with different hair coloring and length, but there she was, my ex-wife, standing arm in arm with Hannah's uncle. I presumed the young woman with them was my daughter, though she was not named. From there, I was able to use Facebook to track down my ex-wife and hence my daughter. Using certain tools, I was able to check the uncle's and my ex-wife's online presence, including some emails and correspondences that hinted at a much greater than normal level of relationship. The uncle also had several hidden links to dubious sites, and the pieces slowly began to come together. The details were sketchy, and the evidence I had wasn't enough to prove anything in court, but I began to form a picture. I saw it this way: Hannah's uncle had made unwelcome advances, or perhaps worse, and Hannah had stopped going to see him. Fearing that she might tell someone, he murdered her. I suspected that he and my ex-wife were involved in an affair, and she helped cover up his crime by tampering with the evidence, adding my DNA to Hannah's clothing and her blood onto my trainers and tracksuit. It made sense that he wouldn't want me out and investigating. I also suspected that I had an idea of who the hit-and-run driver was, though I couldn't confirm it yet. I still couldn't understand why my ex-wife would do this to me, but I intended to find out. As my release date approached, I was supposed to be transferred to an open prison to prepare for my return to society. However, the level of threats against me made the authorities very cautious, so I was secretly transferred to another prison and kept isolated from other inmates, with few even among the staff knowing I was there. During this time, I shaved off my long hair and beard and dyed my now completely gray hair, making myself look years younger, save for my eyes. Those showed the weight of 20 years. 20 years to the day of my initial remand in custody. I was released back into the world with a new identity, courtesy of the Witness Rehabilitation Program for high-risk prisoners, and a new look. Normally, I would have been expected to check in with the police regularly, but someone had decided that might not be the best idea in my case. I was rehoused in a nearly derelict flat and signed up for job seeker benefits. The next month was spent trying to get my head around a country and a way of life that had changed beyond recognition. I had skills, but anyone seeing the name on my certificates might just put two and two together, though I had been assured that eventually new certificates would be issued. The only advantage I had was that no one knew I'd been released. The press and public presumed my release would be from the day I was sentenced, a common mistake. The Friends of Hannah group planned to hold a protest outside the prison to mark my release, and I intended to be there to get some pictures of a few of them. Using the money in my old account, I purchased a decent digital SLR camera with a telephoto lens and traveled back to Lakeside on the day of the protest. I watched from a distance as they gathered and began picking out individuals. I soon spotted Hannah's uncle, though his wife and children weren't with him. It didn't take long to spot my ex-wife, Deborah, too. I watched while the demonstration ran its course, and I was deciding just who to follow when they made my mind up for me. Deborah and the uncle left together, holding hands. I trailed them to a small pub and positioned myself in a booth next to theirs, listening in with a small recording device. "I reckon they smuggled him out the back," said the uncle. "Probably," said Deborah. "Still, hopefully someone will report him, and society will deal with him before he starts looking into what really happened. If they don't, I will. He's the only one with a motivation to dig up the past," the uncle said forcefully. "Relax, he might just keep his head down," Deborah said. "You don't believe that any more than I do," said the uncle. "He already had Linda on our trail. If my friend at the station hadn't destroyed that letter, we might have been found out then." "What's done is done," said Deborah. "Linda is out of the way thanks to you, and that trail is cold now." "He still knows," the uncle replied. "He only knows what happened to him and suspects what happened to Hannah. He doesn't know about the others," Deborah whispered. "Shoo! Anyone could be listening," the uncle said, looking around nervously. "It's a pub. No one's interested," Deborah replied, glancing around but failing to spot me in the nearby booth. "Yes, well, if anyone found out about our little hobby, what happened to Mark would look like a child's play," said the uncle. "Who will find out?" Deborah said dismissively. "It's not like the girls are coming back from where Omar's gang takes them. Even if one escaped, they couldn't identify us. It's made us a lot of money," Deborah said. "But Mark could jeopardize that, so you're probably right. We need him removed." "Got to find him first," the uncle replied. "Now drink up. We've got time for some fun. You're going to love the new recording I have," Deborah said with a disturbing grin. I sat there, numb, processing what I had overheard. I knew I had a decision to make, one that depended on the recording I had just captured. I stayed at the pub for nearly an hour, my mind in turmoil, feeling numb inside. I realized that I still had a long way to go to uncover the full truth, but now I had a lead. It would take me almost a year of careful investigation, hacking, and following the uncle's activities to piece together the extent of what was happening. I kept my head down and set up a small online legal advice service, gradually earning enough income to sustain myself while remaining anonymous. My suspicions were confirmed. Hannah's uncle, my ex-wife, and a network of criminals, including a man named Omar who ran a trafficking ring, were part of a much larger operation that extended into politics, law enforcement, and social services. It took a long time to put the pieces together because what I initially thought was a localized criminal enterprise soon revealed itself to be a nationwide organization, reaching the highest levels of the political and civil establishment. The network involved prominent figures, local councillors, MPs, senior civil servants, judges, magistrates, and even senior police officers, dating back over 2 decades. Several members of the original investigation team from Hannah's case had ties to this ring. It was an insidious operation where those in positions of power protected each other, enabling a cycle of abuse and trafficking that seemed impossible to penetrate. My next objective was to bring them down. I began writing about my experiences and the evidence I had uncovered, compiling everything into a detailed expose titled An Innocent Man. I wrote under a pseudonym and published the content on a website hosted on servers in the United States, trusting in their stronger protections for freedom of speech. I was careful to ensure the website was secure and difficult to trace back to me. Next, I anonymously posted links to the expose on various forums, websites, and social media pages, particularly those connected to the Friends of Hannah group, knowing that the press monitored them for updates. Initially, the posts were frequently deleted, but persistence paid off, and soon a major newspaper picked up on the story, causing a media frenzy. Denials from those implicated came swiftly, but the evidence I had gathered, illegal or not, was hard to dismiss. The photos, recordings, and documented connections forced people to take a closer look. As more journalists started digging into the story, the web of corruption became clearer. Despite attempts to suppress the publication, the story gained traction, with the website mirroring the content across multiple platforms to ensure it stayed accessible. The public outcry grew louder, and soon there were calls for a formal investigation. The government and those implicated scrambled to contain the damage, with some officials attempting to discredit the expose as mere conspiracy theories. However, the mounting evidence was undeniable, and eventually, questions were asked in Parliament, putting immense pressure on the Prime Minister to address the scandal. He attempted to dismiss the claims with vague reassurances, but it wasn't enough. The next day's headlines were filled with outrage, with demands for justice. The fallout was swift. Arrests began with Hannah's uncle, who had attempted to flee the country, and my ex-wife, along with other shadowy figures tied to the trafficking ring. This in turn opened up a massive can of worms as the arrested individuals began to implicate others in positions of power to mitigate their own circumstances. The scope of the operation was bigger than anyone had imagined, with the investigation uncovering cases of abuse, cover-ups, and corruption that had spanned decades. I had to smile at the irony when some of the same journalists who had labeled me a monster years ago were now praising me for exposing the truth. Suddenly, public opinion was shifting in my favor, with many stating that they had always had doubts about the original verdict. I vividly remembered how they had demonized me back then. Still, I wasn't interested in their belated attempts to redeem themselves. The story continued to dominate headlines as more figures from various institutions were implicated. There was a massive protest in London, led by Hannah's aunt, who had taken over the Friends of Hannah group after her husband's arrest. The protesters, mostly women and children, demanded justice for the victims and action against those in power who had covered up the crimes. They were not supposed to approach Parliament Square, but the sheer size of the crowd, estimated at over 300,000, made it impossible for the police to stop them. The protesters continued down Whitehall, with shoppers and office workers joining in along the way. The speeches were heartfelt and painful to hear, as stories of victims who had suffered at the hands of the ring came to light. The protesters made it clear they would not back down until those responsible were held to account. Several MPs and prominent figures tried to argue that the accusations amounted to trial by media, claiming that due process should be respected. But their arguments fell flat, as the sheer scale of the evidence showed that these crimes had been allowed to go on unchecked for far too long. Finally, the government collapsed after a failed vote of no confidence, prompting a snap election. Every party pledged to tackle the issue of organized abuse, with many longtime MPs deciding not to seek re-election after being implicated in my expose. As the ring turned on itself, further arrests followed. High-profile trials gripped the nation, with chilling details emerging about the extent of the trafficking network and the involvement of public officials. Meanwhile, my name remained a subject of intense interest. There were rumors that the authorities were searching for me, as I had not only hacked into private communications but also illegally recorded conversations. I wasn't exactly hiding, but I kept a low profile, moving from place to place and using cash exclusively. I never stayed in one location for too long and made sure not to leave a digital trail. My appearance had changed drastically since my release, making me harder to recognize. Eventually, I was arrested in what seemed like a last-ditch effort by the establishment to take me down along with the people I had exposed. However, as soon as I was taken into custody, public pressure mounted for my release. The same newspapers that had condemned me years ago now ran articles defending my actions as a public service. There were even calls for me to receive a royal pardon. Word eventually came down from the highest authorities that prosecuting me would not be in the public interest, and I was released without charge. As I walked out of the station, a crowd of reporters swarmed around me. "Will you be suing the state for wrongful arrest and imprisonment?" one reporter asked. "No. It would only come out of the taxpayers' pockets, and I don't need the money," I answered, causing a ripple of surprise. "Surely you think you're owed some recompense," another reporter pressed. "Can they give me back 18 years of my life? Restore my reputation? Will my name cease to be used as a byword for something vile?" I asked. "I did this for Hannah and for Linda. I didn't do it for revenge or compensation." I could tell my words left an impact. "What will you do now?" someone shouted as I was escorted to a waiting car. "I'll continue seeking justice for the ones who never had a voice," I said, before leaving the press behind. The aftermath of the expose was far-reaching. Hannah's uncle and my ex-wife both received multiple life sentences for their roles in the murder of Hannah and the conspiracy to frame me. Hannah's body was eventually found buried under a shed in her uncle's yard, where evidence suggested she had been alive when placed there. Her remains were laid to rest beside her mother, Linda, in a grave that had remained empty for years. The other members of the trafficking ring were also given long sentences, ranging from 10 years to life imprisonment, depending on their level of involvement. Investigations into the care system continued, uncovering more abuse cases, and changes were implemented to prevent such a scandal from happening again. For me, life was not the same, but I was free. I continued to live under my assumed name, keeping a low profile and avoiding public attention. I had established a small but growing online legal advice business, and I used my skills to help people who had been wrongfully accused or suffered from miscarriages of justice. On the anniversary of Linda's death, I visited her grave beside Hannah's. While Hannah's grave was well tended, Linda's had been somewhat neglected, so I took the time to tidy it up before placing a single white rose on her headstone. "I did what I promised, Linda," I said with tears in my eyes. "I'm so sorry I put you at risk. I'll never forgive myself for that." "Dad?" a voice called from behind me. I turned to see 2 women and 2 young men standing nearby. One woman was in her 40s, and the other in her early 20s. "It is you, isn't it, Dad?" the younger woman said. "Emma?" I asked. "I knew it," Emma exclaimed. "I told Rachel you'd come today." I recognized Rachel as Hannah's aunt. She nodded in recognition. "We've all been to Hannah's grave," she said, "but no one has visited Linda's until now." "I owe her everything," I replied. "She was the only one who believed in me, and she paid a terrible price." Emma stepped toward me and hesitated, sensing my discomfort. I instinctively tensed up, adopting a defensive posture. "Sorry," I said, forcing myself to relax. "Trust doesn't come easily to me these days." "I'm sorry too, Dad," Emma said softly. "When the truth came out, I blamed you for Mom's arrest. But as it turned out, you were the only one who was truly innocent. And Hannah and Linda," I added, my voice tinged with sadness, "along with the countless other victims of that network." "Yes," Emma agreed, tears forming in her eyes. I don't know how to begin to make up for all these lost years." Rachel stepped forward, her expression softening. "Mark, we owe you an apology, all of us," she said. "We just assumed, and we were wrong. It's hard to come to terms with what's happened." "There's no use crying over spilled milk," I replied, my voice calm but weary. "What's done is done." Emma took a step closer. "Dad, I know this is a lot, but do you think we could start to get to know each other again?" "Of course," I replied, though there was a hesitation in my voice. "But don't expect too much. I've spent too much time away from ordinary life." One of the young men approached and held out his hand. "Mr. Smith, I'm Jake, Hannah's cousin. I just want to apologize for what my family did to you. Please call me Mark," I said, shaking his hand. "And your family has nothing to apologize for. You didn't know the truth." The other young man approached, his demeanor gentle. "I'm Ethan, Emma's fiancé," he said. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Smith." "Pleased to meet you too, Ethan. And please, call me Mark," I acknowledged. "Dad," Emma said, her voice trembling with hope, "would you give me away at our wedding? It's not for a while yet, but it would mean the world to me." I was taken aback, feeling a mixture of joy and pain. "I'd be honored," I replied. "I never thought I'd get that chance." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she flung herself into my arms, sobbing. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I was always told to forget about you, but I never did." "You were young," I said gently, holding her close. "You loved your mom, and that's understandable. Everyone believed I was a monster, and I don't blame you for that." "I do still love Mom," she said, her voice small. "But I don't know how to feel about her anymore." Rachel spoke up. "We should go somewhere more private. There's a cafe nearby where we can sit and talk." We left the cemetery and went to a nearby cafe, sitting around a table with warm drinks. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, like the first glimmers of dawn after a long, dark night. "I have a favor to ask, Mark," Rachel said cautiously. "Go ahead," I replied. "The Friends of Hannah group fell apart after the scandal broke. It's been labeled as a front for the ring because of what my husband did," she explained. "It was supposed to help vulnerable girls, not exploit them. We've lost a lot of support and I'm trying to rebuild it. But I can't do it alone." "What do you need from me?" I asked. "We want you to be the new president," Rachel said. "Your story has touched a lot of people. It would help us regain the public's trust and rebuild the organization to actually support the children it was meant to help." I sat quietly, considering her words. I had spent so many years isolated, wary of anyone, and now I was being asked to step back into the public eye. The thought of it was daunting. "I'll help," I said finally. "But we may need to change the name. It's too closely tied to the scandal." "I've thought about that," Rachel agreed. "I was considering calling it the Linda Foundation in her memory." The suggestion took me by surprise, and I felt a lump form in my throat. "Linda's legacy," I murmured, testing the sound of it. "Yes, I think that would be a fitting tribute." The others around the table nodded in agreement. Over the next few years, my life gradually transformed. The Linda Foundation quickly grew into a successful charity, and my association with it helped to rebuild public confidence. We focused on supporting children who had been exploited and worked to reform the very systems that had failed them. With Rachel's help, I navigated the complexities of public life and charity work, slowly emerging from the shadows. Emma kept her promise and stayed in touch. I did indeed give her away at her wedding, and my speech at the reception was a hit, despite a few bad puns. For the first time in decades, I felt the warmth of family. My parents even attended, though it was awkward at first. Took time, but our relationship began to heal. They had struggled with their own guilt over abandoning me and believed, at the time, they had done the right thing. My online legal aid business continued to grow, and I used it to provide help to those who, like me, had been wrongly accused or had suffered miscarriages of justice. I had come full circle, helping others find the justice that had so long eluded me. The Linda Foundation thrived, expanding its reach and influence. It wasn't just a charity. It became an advocate for change, fighting for reforms in the social care system and exposing those who tried to exploit it. Many of those involved in the original trafficking ring continued to serve lengthy prison sentences, some experiencing firsthand the harsh realities of prison life. There were still occasional threats from those who held grudges or sought to protect their secrets, but I remained vigilant. On the anniversary of Hannah's death, I visited the cemetery once more. I placed a white rose on her grave and one on Linda's, silently promising that I would continue to fight for justice in her memory. It was never about revenge. It was about finding the truth and making sure no one else suffered as we had. As I walked away, I thought of how much had changed. I was no longer defined by the wrongful conviction or the years spent behind bars. I had a future again, a cause worth fighting for, and, perhaps, even the beginning of a new family. For the first time in a long while, I felt something that had eluded me for so many years: hope. Thanks for watching this powerful story. Do you think you could ever forgive after everything Mark went through? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.